Viralnater presents Ed Sullivan's Arch-Nemesis, the singer he despised. Ed Sullivan was one of the most well-known and loved TV hosts in U.S. history. He won hearts all over the world as the host of the Ed Sullivan Show, which ran for a very long time and was a huge hit. He also had a special knack for picking out the next big stars to appear on his show as their big break. The star had great numbers and was popular all over the world. But he had a lot of secrets, including nasty fights with some of his famous guests. Let's remember the amazing true story of how this TV star became famous. Born a star. E.V. Sullivan was born in Harlem, New York on September 28, 1901. He grew up in an Irish-American family that loved art, music, and history. Sullivan knew he'd be a star early on. He started playing as an athlete. For his school, he won baseball, basketball, and football. The Golden Boy. Sullivan wasn't a very likely star during his time. Other hosts of variety shows were smooth and happy, but he looked nervous and didn't smile. Critics and fans alike liked Sullivan's serious face and unwavering honesty. He won Peabody and Golden Globe Awards for his work. Still, reviewers liked the way he presented things in a way that wasn't typical. Taking on Prejudice. Sullivan played sports with people of many different races and backgrounds in high school. This made him more committed to tolerance and acceptance, which he tried to include in his show, even though his TV bosses told him not to. Even though he was criticized, Sullivan was one of the few hosts who had black artists on. Sullivan's shows made stars of artists like the Supremes, James Brown, and Louis Armstrong. Love Young. When Sullivan was young, he became close with his teammates on the field. After playing team sports with friends and opponents of different races, he became an activist against racism. But his sports youth was also full of love and pain. While Ed was still young, he got engaged to Olympic swimmer Sybil Bauer. Bauer, who was 23, died of cancer in 1924, and it made Sullivan very sad. The teen star-to-be would have another chance at love. Great news. Sullivan moved from high school sports to news and entertainment after getting married. Afterward, he wrote news stories for the Evening Graphic and the New York Daily News. People knew him for the theater and entertainment news piece Little Old New York in the New York Daily News. By 1941, Sullivan was so popular that CBS hired him to host Summer Silver Theater, which was the start of his career. One More Chance. After 2 years, Sullivan's heart began to heal from the loss of Sybil Bauer. Whenever he met Sylvia Weinstein, he was ready to fall in love again. Weinstein lied and said Sullivan was Solomon because her Jewish family didn't want her to marry an Irish Catholic. When the family finally found out the truth, they got married in 1930 under their names. She didn't know that her husband would become famous in Hollywood. Little Betty. After getting married to Weinstein, Sullivan quickly made her home life nice. A month after they got married, they found out that his beloved wife was pregnant. In 1930, they had a girl and named her Betty after Sullivan's mother, who had died a few months before. They had no idea that they were about to enter the world of Hollywood, which would change their lives forever. Being on stage. People loved Ed Sullivan for more than just how skilled and calm he was. Sullivan was known for stuttering and hesitation when he spoke. People could relate to him and liked him because of this. Some of Sullivan's guests behind the scenes had a hard time with how relaxed he was. Making stars. There were other big stars on the Ed Sullivan Show besides Sullivan. It quickly became the place where bands and performers who wanted to get big went. It was like your first move in the game when you were on Sullivan's Show. People knew that Sullivan could find the best and brightest performers, and some of his guests went on to become the biggest stars of the time. Many of his guests had personal grudges against him, even though being on his show was a surefire way to get ahead. Being mindful. On the show, Ed Sullivan brought some of the biggest and best names in entertainment to the public's attention and brought attention to serious and important issues. In 1953, Sullivan had Broadway director Joshua Logan on his show to talk about his mental illness and stay in a mental hospital. Sullivan thought this show was the best part of his work because it raised knowledge about mental illness in the United States. Sullivan did more good than that with his new scheme. Toast on TV. CBS noticed that Ed Sullivan was a great host after he appeared on the Summer Silver Theater. It was only natural for the directors to pick him up to host their new comedy, The Toast of the Town, which would feature new and interesting performers. Because of Sullivan's amazing skills, the show was called the Ed Sullivan Broadcast. Guest stars. It's known that Ed Sullivan can spot great potential. He thought that hundreds of artists were good, so he asked them to appear on his show. People watched to see what new artists he'd bring on, but he also had well-known artists play more than once. Senor Wences and his dummy Topo Gigio was one of Sullivan's most famous regular shows. Sullivan, on the other hand, was rude to some of his guests and never asked them back. His Majesty. In 1956, the Ed Sullivan Show reached another important milestone. A lot of people in America fell in love with rock and roll on September 9, 1968. The king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, made his first performance. About 86.2% of the country watched this well-known show because it was so popular. Sullivan helped a lot of great artists get started, but his private fights could have ended the careers of others. Beatles craze. In 1964, Ed Sullivan had a band from Liverpool on his show. This band, which is well known in the UK, wanted to make a splash in America with this show. Can you name the band? Yes, this British group of 5 was the Beatles. The Beatles' first act on Sullivan's show was seen by 74 million people, which is more than a third of the U.S. population. Real friendship. Even though many people didn't like the black artists on Sullivan's show, he didn't care about what people thought about them and kept giving them a chance that they weren't getting anywhere else. Even after the artist died, Sullivan stayed close friends with him. He paid for his funeral because Sullivan was a close friend of Bill Bojangles Robinson. Fans or enemies. By now, everyone in the United States knew who Sullivan was on TV. Sullivan's name was also linked to success. Getting on the show seemed to promise fame. Behind the scenes, Sullivan was known for yelling at guests who didn't act or behave properly, even though he was smart and well-liked. If you upset the star, you could be sure that your show ticket would be taken away. Making a difference. A TV show years later showed the truth about Sullivan's show and how he tried to fight racism and help black singers get jobs. Subdivision looked at how Sullivan's work for equality and against racism changed society in the United States and other places. On the show, black stars like the Jackson 5, Marvin Gaye, Lena Horne, Smokey Robinson, and Nat King Cole and Ray Charles got their start. Creating magic. There was no doubt that Ed Sullivan was the best at finding hugely popular entertainment stars. He had a sixth sense that let him know which acts his crowds would enjoy and give them a chance to become famous. Damage over time. Mason told about the finger episode many years later. He thought about the move, he told Vanity Fair. Even though they came to an understanding 2 years later, and he went back to school, he said the claims hurt him for years. "It hurt my career for at least 10 to 15 years, he said. Back then, having a bad look could get you killed. Today, a gross picture of you makes you popular." Lots of movies. Will Jordan, an actor and comedian, also made a name for himself by pretending to be Ed Sullivan. Jordan impersonated the famous host of The Ed Sullivan Show in many movies. His acting felt real and was funny. It was 1978 for I Want to Hold Your Hand, 1991 for The Doors, 1992 for Mr. Saturday Night, and 2003 for Down with Love. Sullivan's charm made his job and many others possible. Fame and stardom. It's not just tourists who become famous after being on the show. At this point, Sullivan was one of the most popular TV stars in the United States. Every time his show played, the number of viewers went up. By 1954, more than 12 million people watched the show every week. And by the 1960s, 14 million people did. It was clear that Sullivan was popular, but things were getting worse behind the scenes. Not good pairs. People knew Sullivan as the best at finding talent and getting shows off the ground, but they also knew he was sensitive and held grudges. Buddy Holly's appearance on the show was well known. When Sullivan meets Holly, he purposely says his name wrong to make things tense. Oh my! What led to this insult in public? The racy words in his song "Oh Boy" were supposedly asked to be toned down by him, but Holly refused. This was the first of many industry feuds that Sullivan got into. The Diddley Squat. Another person who competed with Ed Sullivan was the famous singer Bo Diddley. Before going on the show, Bo Diddley wasn't sure which song he was supposed to play on stage, so he played two, or would have if Sullivan hadn't cut him off after the first one. Sullivan wouldn't let Diddley back on the show because he was angry that he didn't follow the rules. Diddley became a huge star anyway. Close the Doors. In 1967, Jim Morrison and the Doors played, which caused another fight. Before the show, Sullivan told Morrison he couldn't sing one line from Light by Fire because he thought it was about drugs. Even though Morrison agreed, he sang the illegal line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," when he appeared. Even though it doesn't seem like much now, Sullivan was mad and told Morrison he could never come back on the show. Not me, girl. There were other artists besides Jim Morrison and the Doors whose racy songs had to be changed to fit the traditional tastes of the Ed Sullivan Show. Morrison took a chance by using bad language, but some requests for screening led to arguments before the actions were even done. Bob Dylan was supposed to play, but he was told to tone down the political topics in his songs. Dylan said no, and after the dress practice, he left the show. Hold on rolling. Not all of the acts on Sullivan's show were upset when their naughtier songs were banned or taken off the show. The Rolling Stones were asked to change the words "Let's spend the night together" to "Let's spend some time together" in more than one show. Though Jagger agreed, it was clear how he felt by the way he rolled his eyes on stage while singing the new lines. This and the messy way the band looked made Ed Sullivan very angry. Fight of the Fingers. A few years after the Bo Diddley Show, the famous comedian Jackie Mason was hired by the Ed Sullivan Show for 6 shows worth $45,000 each. There was an event that ended this deal in 1964. During the finger incident, Jackie Mason pointed at Sullivan, who wasn't on camera. Sullivan thought Mason was calling him names. Because Sullivan cares about politeness and proper TV behavior, he's embarrassed, and Mason's contract quickly ended. After that, they had a long court battle over the charges. Well-known fights. Sullivan had to deal with reports of star fights all through his career. Some are true because they argued in public on the show, while others are made up by Hollywood. He fought Walter Winchell, Steve Allen, Frank Sinatra, Jack Parr, Nat King Cole, and Arthur Godfrey over the years. People may have imagined trouble behind the scenes because he never smiled, or it could all be true. We'll never know. Multiple skills. Even though he did some bad things and got into fights afterward, the host treated many of Sullivan's guests with joy and love. As part of his show, Sullivan also invited a wide range of singers, not just pop and rock stars. Liberace was a great artist who was known for his strange behavior and funny acts. But this wasn't even close to being the most exciting part of the show. Tiger fear. Clyde Bey, who tamed animals on the Ed Sullivan Show, was a great talent in many ways. For one of his most famous shows, Bey did something with tigers, but the stage was too small. He did it anyway, though, and the results were terrible. Bey lost control of the monsters, so Sullivan kept the crowd busy while the monsters were calmed down. Top Pops. Sullivan had a long career and brought many future and present artists to his show. Fans and artists alike had a great time at some shows, so many stars came back to repeat performances. Did you know that Roberta Peters, an opera singer known for her work with the Metropolitan Opera Company, was on the most? Peters was on 67 times altogether. Oh my! A man for the millennium. Even though the Ed Sullivan Show ran for 40 years, it's still hard to believe how many shows it had. Sullivan had 1,068 episodes over its time on the air. The Simpsons has only had 776 episodes, so this run is much longer. Ay caramba, that run is crazy. Status as a star. Even though he had fights and terrible special acts, Ed Sullivan became a Hollywood star. He became a surprise entertainment star, but his shyness and clumsiness made him easier to talk and less scary than other stunning TV hosts. In the 1960s, Sullivan got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, which made him even more famous. Over the years, Sullivan won several awards. Unique place. Even though Sullivan died more than 50 years ago, Hollywood is still affected by him. Today, other well-known entertainment shows film at the same location where Ed Sullivan Show did. But they never forget that he inspired them. It used to be called The Late Show and is now called the Ed Sullivan Theater. David Letterman and Stephen Colbert hosted the show. Mates Mason. Sullivan had fights and feuds with many of the stars who appeared on his show throughout his long career, but after he died, many of them came out to honor him. As Mason told Vanity Fair, he was a wonderful guy. She said that his argumentativeness came from feeling bad about himself. He was the classiest and nicest man off the show. Before every show, he got excited and scared on stage. He felt awkward and was trying to make the show better. Time to unwind. Sullivan must have been glad to finish the program after 22 years of being a part of it. He was already one of the most famous TV stars of all time, but his job had made him famous in a way he never thought possible. Now he needed to take it easy and enjoy his family. Sullivan was ready to stop working, but something bad happened. Unwilling rocker. His memory goes on as inspiring and interesting stories about the secrets of his famous show come out. Everyone knows that Elvis Presley's appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show was a major turning point in the history of rock and roll. Did you know that Sullivan didn't want the rock star on his show at first? He thought that pushing his hips was inappropriate for his family. He changed his mind, though, so we could all see the King's famous show. How to play the long game. The Ed Sullivan Show is one of the most watched and longest-running TV shows in the United States. You'll be surprised by how long this famous program's been around. It gets better after 22 years, even though that's a long time. The 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s were great times during those 22 years. Each decade's Hollywood stars were all made by the same guy. Impressions that last. Sullivan's influence goes beyond how fondly and proudly Americans remember the best parts of his show. Sullivan's famous and unique attitude is still linked to a lot of entertainment acts. Impressionist artists like Nick Toth and Jerome Patrick Hoban have caught his unique qualities. If you've watched the video jobs here, depend on them being enjoyed able to imitate Sullivan. The end of an era. Even though the Ed Sullivan Show had a great run in the 1970s, fewer and fewer people were watching. Ratings fell from 14 million in 1970, which may seem a lot, but most American homes had TVs, so much higher numbers were needed for success. When ratings dropped, NBC bosses stopped this popular show. The time was over. Day off. Even less known is the fact that Elvis first appeared. Fans who paid attention might have seen that Ed Sullivan wasn't on the show that day, so he didn't introduce the famous singer. He did it not because he didn't like Elvis, but for a much bigger reason. Sullivan had to go to the hospital after a terrible car accident and couldn't host the show that day. From his hospital bed, he watched the show on TV. Hidden sadness. Ed Sullivan's retirement didn't last long, which was a shame. In 1974, his family found out he had esophageal cancer, which is very rare and very bad. Because the beloved TV star was already in bad health, his family and doctors chose not to tell him the full extent of his illness to protect his mental health. Once Sullivan had done his job, he deserved a quiet death. Goodbye. A few weeks after doctors told his family he wouldn't live, Sullivan died at New York's Lenox Hill Hospital on October 13, 1974. Nearly 3,000 people came to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to see him buried because he was so well liked. Many stars who were thought to be Sullivan's enemies showed up to celebrate him, which shocked a lot of people. If you've watched the video till here, that means you've enjoyed the video. Subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notifications bell icon